In April of 1961, a secret war cooked up in Washington, D.C., was fought by Cuban exiles on a remote tropical beach. Now, this was an operation that was supposed to topple a new dictator. Instead, it became one of America's most humiliating foreign policy disasters. A perfect failure, really. One that ended up making Castro stronger and pushed the entire world one giant leap closer to nuclear war. So the question is, how did a plan this big, this detailed, go so spectacularly wrong? Let's get into it.
And this quote right here, it really gets to the heart of the whole thing. To understand why the U.S. was willing to risk so much, you have to realize that for decades, Cuba wasn't just another country. It was, for all intents and purposes, America's backyard. So when Fidel Castro came to power, it wasn't some far-off political event. No, it was a direct challenge to a half-century of American dominance, happening just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. And that challenge is what lit the fuse for the entire Bay of Pigs invasion.
All right, so how did it all go down? We're going to break down this perfect failure into 5 key parts. We'll start with the revolution that kicked this whole thing off, then we'll uncover the CIA's secret plan to undo it, we'll walk through the absolutely disastrous 3-day invasion, count the cost, human and political, and finally we'll see how this one event set the table for an even bigger Cold War crisis.
Okay, first up, how exactly did Cuba go from being a, let's say, compliant neighbor to a major flashpoint in the Cold War? This timeline really tells the story, doesn't it? You can see a clear pattern. From the moment Cuba even became a republic, the U.S. was all over it, economically, militarily. I mean, look at this. U.S. Marines were stationed on the island multiple times just to protect American business interests. So when Fidel Castro and his rebels marched into Havana in 1959, you have to understand, they weren't just overthrowing the brutal dictator Batista. They were rejecting this entire history of American oversight. Yeah, see, for so many Cubans, Batista's government was just a corrupt, repressive dictatorship. Castro, on the other hand, at first he looked like a liberator. He promised to bring back democracy, reform the land system, break the cycle of corruption. His slogan was revolution first, elections later. And honestly, a lot of people who were just desperate for change were willing to go along with that. This popular support he had, well, that's a huge piece of the puzzle that American planners would fatally misjudge.
But of course, the U.S. government saw things very, very differently. The second Castro started nationalizing American businesses and getting cozy with the Soviet Union, the Eisenhower administration decided, okay, this guy's got to go. And that set in motion a secret plan that the new president, John F. Kennedy, would end up inheriting. So the CIA's initial plan was pretty complex. It wasn't just about storming the beaches. No, it was about creating the conditions for Castro to be overthrown. The idea was to weaken him from the inside using propaganda and spies, while at the same time building up an army of Cuban exiles outside the country. The official goal, and this is the really crucial part, was to make the whole thing look like a Cuban-led uprising with, get this, no appearance of U.S. intervention. Plausible deniability. And this is where things get, well, kind of bonkers. The lengths they were willing to go to were pretty wild. They tried to sabotage the sugar industry, which was the backbone of Cuba's economy. They even partnered up with the mafia to try and assassinate Castro and his top guys. And then you get to the truly bizarre stuff. Poison pills, a booby-trapped seashell for when he went diving, a contaminated wetsuit. I mean, it sounds like something straight out of a spy movie, but this was all part of a very real, very secret war against Castro. Now this right here, this is where a decision was made that basically sealed the invasion's fate. When JFK came into office, the plan he inherited was to land at the city of Trinidad. Tactically, it made sense. It had a port, and there were mountains nearby for the fighters to retreat into if things went south. But Kennedy was nervous. An attack on a city would make U.S. involvement way too obvious. So, to keep America's fingerprints off it, he ordered the landing site moved to the Bahia de Cochinos, the Bay of Pigs. And this change, it was a catastrophic mistake. The new spot was a remote swamp, surrounded by treacherous coral reefs that would tear up the landing craft, and worse, there were no escape routes. The brigade would be completely trapped. Okay, so now we get to the invasion itself, a plan that was years in the making, involving more than 1,400 trained exiles, and it would completely fall apart in just 72 hours. Let's look at how it all went wrong, step by agonizing step. It all kicked off with a massive failure. On April 15th, 2 days before the landing, CIA-backed bombers with fake Cuban markings hit Castro's airfields. The problem? The strike was a mess. It left most of his small air force completely intact. Then, in the dead of night on April 17th, as Brigade 2506 started hitting the beaches, they were spotted almost immediately. By sunrise, just look at the timeline. Castro's planes were already in the air, attacking the invaders' supply ships. The entire operation started to unravel before the brigade could even dig in. And if you had to point to the single moment the invasion became unwinnable, this is it. Castro's pilots sank the Rio Escondido. This one ship was the brigade's entire lifeline. It had most of their ammo, their food, and, critically, their main radio for talking to the CIA fleet. When that ship went down, the men on the beach were left isolated, running out of supplies, and fighting a battle they could no longer sustain, let alone win. 8. Just 8. This is the number that sealed their fate. The CIA was convinced their preliminary airstrikes had wiped out Castro's air force. They were disastrously wrong. Just 8 surviving planes were enough to completely control the skies over the Bay of Pigs. They sank the supply ships, and they pinned the invaders down on the beaches. It was a single, devastating intelligence failure. And just like that, the invasion was over. In 3 days, the surviving members of Brigade 2506 were either killed or captured. Now the Kennedy administration had to face the music, both the human and the political consequences. To his credit, Kennedy didn't hide. Just 2 days after the surrender, he went in front of the press and publicly took full responsibility. It was a really sobering, really humiliating moment for his young presidency. He basically said, when you win, everyone wants to take credit, but when you lose, nobody wants to own it. But this defeat, he made it crystal clear this one was his. And these numbers, they really show the steep price of that defeat. More than 100 members of the invading brigade were killed. 4 American pilots who were flying support missions also lost their lives. On the other side, Castro's forces lost 176 men. So beyond all the political embarrassment, this was a tragedy with a very real human cost on all sides. So the final chapter for the more than 1,200 captured brigade members didn't end with a daring rescue. It ended with a ransom. After almost 2 years in Cuban prisons, their freedom was bought for $53 million worth of food and medicine. It was just a transactional, humbling end to a secret operation that had started with such high hopes. So why does this failed invasion from over 60 years ago still matter so much? Because its failure wasn't an ending, it was a beginning. The Bay of Pigs was like throwing gasoline on a fire. It dramatically raised the stakes of the Cold War and set the stage for an even more dangerous showdown. Yeah, the fallout was immediate and it was severe. The invasion was a huge miscalculation that achieved the exact opposite of what it was supposed to do. Instead of getting rid of Castro, it turned him into a national hero who had stared down the American giant and won. After that, he openly declared Cuba a Marxist-Leninist state and fully aligned with the Soviet Union. In response, a furious Kennedy administration launched Operation Mongoose, an even bigger sabotage campaign. And all that did was convince the Soviets that their new friend needed protection in the form of nuclear missiles. You don't have to take my word for it. This quote from Che Guevara just a few months later says it all. From Havana's point of view, the American failure was the best thing that ever happened to them. It wiped out any internal opposition, it rallied the entire country behind Castro, and it cemented the revolution's power in a way nothing else could have. The U.S. had accidentally handed its biggest enemy his greatest victory. So that's the bottom line. The Bay of Pigs wasn't just some isolated screw-up in the history books. It drew a direct line straight to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It gave the Soviets a reason and an opening to put nuclear weapons in America's backyard, which led to those 13 days in October 1962 when the entire world held its breath. And that incredible showdown, well, that's a story for our next explainer. To see exactly what happened next in this high-stakes Cold War drama, make sure you check out our next video on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And for more explainers that connect the dots of history just like this one, do us a favor and subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.